It's the week ending Saturday the 12th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a ship sinking off Lampedusa, killing more than 40 migrants. High street retailer Wilko entering administration, putting 12,000 jobs at risk. And Britain's wonkiest pub, the Crooked House, burning down days after being bought by a property firm. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's the boss man, Holden Frith, and Harriet Marsden, and from the Week magazine, assistant editor Leif Arbuthnot. Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are family reunions about to get even more complicated?
Each one going about their lives, evolving, adapting to their particular climate, their particular circumstances, but also periodically meeting, boinking, swapping genes, swapping ideas, trying to pinpoint our direct ancestor, untangling them from this really complicated web of relationships is naturally an extremely difficult thing to do.
Boinking. It's the first time I think we've had a headline news clip with that word in it. The complex evolution of Homo sapiens, a video from Stefan Milo. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Holden, what's the story?
This is the news that we may all have some new and very distant relatives. We're not going to meet them, I'm afraid. The one piece of evidence we have for their existence is the skull of a 12 or 13-year-old who died about 300,000 years ago. This was actually dug up in 2019 in China, but the reason it's back in the news now is that on Monday, researchers said they think it belongs to an entirely new branch of the human family tree.
Okay, so what's taken them 4 years to work that out? Because it's to do with the shape of the skull, isn't it, that's different?
Yeah, I think by the sounds of it, they've been spending that time trying to fit it into one of the known existing branches. But because it has this never before seen combination of bone shapes and structures, they've just found that very difficult. Essentially, it has many of the facial features of early Homo sapiens, i.e. the first versions of us, but the top of the skull and the jawbone, and specifically its regressive chin, look more like those of the Denisovans, which is a lineage of early humans who split off from Neanderthals about 400,000 years ago.
Okay, so this seems, Harriet, like a third category of ancestor we didn't know about.
Actually, the really interesting thing is it's not even an ancestor. So the Denisovans, they actually think there was crossover between our branch, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals, which is the one that we've known about the longest, and the Denisovans, who that was a new branch on our family tree that was only, the DNA was only sequenced in 2010. So really, really, really exciting stuff here. I mean, this is absolutely cutting edge in paleoanthropology. They think that the Denisovans and the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, which is us, actually all crossed over a lot more than previously thought and interbred, which they only know because they sequenced the genome of the Neanderthals. And actually, the guy who did that, he won the Nobel Prize for it just last year. A Swedish researcher whose name I'm probably about to butcher, called Svante Paabo. He sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010, and that's how we found out that we, as humans now, have an astonishing amount of Neanderthal genetic information still within us today. So that's given rise to the theory of interbreeding.
But this new discovery, they're not ancestors of ours. So no one was boinking them.
It's not about who's boinking who, although actually it is about who's boinking who. It's actually exactly about who's boinking who, but it's less about ancestors and more about all of us being from common ancestors, but distantly related. So if you consider a Neanderthal to be like a sibling to the Homo sapiens, let's say, or not a sibling, a cousin, and the Denisovans to be a more distant cousin, we could be looking at another member of our same level, which is if it's true, if this is a new species, it's astonishing.
Are you as astonished, Leif?
I am quite astonished. I have to say, I knew so little about this before Holden suggested the topic. I had no idea that Denisovans even, I didn't know about Denisovans full stop. So, these are not Denisovans, but it's good to know that we've got an extra branch to sort of add on.
Doesn't have as much stigma as Neanderthal, does it?
No. One thing that really surprised me was the kind of the broad timeline of our evolution. So the first primates evolved about 55 million years ago. And then the first modern hand emerged about 1.85 million years ago. And then there was quite a quick development. So sort of 300,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared in Africa, we think. But then there's also been lots of recent evidence that Homo sapiens got to, say, Israel much earlier than we thought. And modern humans are thought to have reached Europe somewhere between 54 and 40,000 years ago. So to me, this doesn't, maybe it sounds like a very long time ago, but if you think about, 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, this is all sort of history that we have fragments of. It's only it's multiples of that. And it feels like there was a sudden kind of whoosh of evolution after the brains started growing to be really big. One mystery in paleoanthropology that I've learnt about in the past few days has been that we still don't know exactly why the brain evolved to be so big. So I'm hoping that maybe in the next few years that research will kind of start digging into that question.
And Harriet mentioned, Holden, the kind of renewed heat that there is in this particular sector of science. Why is that? Why has it not really had as much investigation until recently?
It seems to be advances in DNA collection that's driving a lot of these discoveries. In this particular case of the skull that was unearthed in China, that's not happened yet. This is based on analysis of bone structure, as we were talking about. But with the Denisovans and with the discovery that both they and Neanderthals have interbred much more than previously thought with early Homo sapiens, that is based largely on analysis of the genome, which has been extracted from surviving bone structure, and that's a very delicate and difficult process, and it has only been possible in the last few years. And so I think as that technology develops, we're likely to be able to map out how those what had previously been thought of as quite distinct branches of the family tree, how those have actually been much more intertwined than previously thought, and perhaps find evidence of more branches that have previously been dismissed as either sort of one-off cases of somebody who perhaps had a medical condition that made their skull a different shape than they had, or, as has often happened, almost they've been excused or eliminated as something that was just an intermediate step on a kind of linear transition between an earlier and a later group of people. Now it seems much more that there were these groups coexisting and living alongside each other.
And also which genes might have done what and what's been passed on to us, Harriet. One of the things that I thought was cool reading through this research is that there's one gene that apparently helps modern Tibetans survive at high altitude, which might go back hundreds of thousands of years, and a Neanderthal gene that affects the immune response we have to infections.
I think you've just really put the hammer on the nail of why this new field that Holden was describing, which they call paleogenomics, is so incredibly interesting, and it's so incredibly important because it really gets down to the fundamentals of who we are, where we came from, and what it is that makes us uniquely human. Because what paleogenomics is doing, and it's worth noting, by the way, that sequencing the Neanderthal DNA, it took decades. I mean, not years, it took decades. And Denisovans were only identified by the first species to be identified by DNA in 2010. So it takes so long to extract this information. But once we've sequenced the genomes, it's much quicker. But the reason that it's so important, and this is where it gets really, really, really exciting, is that paleogenomics it's effectively making the case for the biological benefits of diversity. So if we have this now understanding that Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and Denisovans, and possibly maybe another species as well, all interbred, and significantly more than can be explained by violence or rape, for example, if they're now starting to think that might be one of the theories is that might be one of the reasons that Homo sapiens survived, is because we have this hybrid DNA that, as you say, affects immune systems and things. So it's absolutely incredible. The fact that Homo sapiens was more successfully adaptable could be because of its cosmopolitan, intermingled, interbreeding diversity.
But then that also makes us less unique, Leaf, than perhaps people, particularly religious leaders, might have thought we were.
Yeah, I mean, there's been obviously a lot of ill done in the name of kind of ideas about distinct groups, sort of racial groups especially. So I agree with Harriet that research in the past 10 years has kind of done a lot of work towards sort of breaking down those largely untrue sort of stereotypes about groups. But one thing that I think floats above this story, which I think is worth sort of pulling out, is that we're not that far away from the sort of gorillas and monkeys in the sort of jungles of Africa, or whatever climate they were living in. And I think it's a good reminder when I'm being stupid, or I'm feeling I'm being annoying because I'm hungry or thirsty or whatever. It's because the roots are there to be seen in this research. We're all basically monkeys, and we haven't evolved enormously since then.
Is that what you take from it as well, Holden?
I think that's true, and it's sort of another step on that path away from the religious idea that humans and animals are all immutable and ordained. And I think as soon as you start talking about human evolution, you think about that line drawing with the monkey on the left and the human on the right, and the various intermediate steps, and they're all kind of walking one after the other in the same direction. But I think what this suggests is actually that idea of a kind of predestined progression from one form to another it sort of owes as much to the religious idea of a great chain of being as it does to what evolutionary science is now telling us, which is a lot of interweaving paths with dead ends and kind of branching possibilities. And we have the reason we have survived is partly because of the instincts that allowed us to survive on the plains and in the mountains and in sort of various different bits. And now that we're sitting around in offices, some of those instincts don't necessarily help us, but they are part of who we are, and we can't escape them all.
But how are they applicable, Harriet, these findings? I mean, that's the thing I think that some people listening to this might be feeling. It's a bit like when we talk about space. Yes, it's exciting to have a discovery that means we've learned more for its own sake. But what use is that knowledge outside of the sphere of academics that are interested in the answer to these questions? How does it apply to my life, knowing this?
Well, I think that's what makes this story so special, is that it probably does more than most stories that we talk about. Because if we go from the theory of interbreeding and hybridization and the fact that human Homo sapiens now has a large amount of DNA from Denisovans, Neanderthals, possibly elsewhere. The original theory was that Homo sapiens wiped out Neanderthals in a very violent, competitive, possibly xenophobic, racially aggravated way. If the theory now, based on the DNA that we're looking at, is that actually not only were all these different species interbreeding and mingling and cooperating, but that Homo sapiens benefited from that. If we're saying that our species has benefited from being more open and more tolerant and possibly more diverse than we are as a society now, I mean, the story raises the question, was ancient Homo sapiens more tolerant than we are now? And if so, was that why we survived? Why we're the only humans on the planet today?
How woke was society 800,000 years ago?
I think that has huge implications. It's the biological case for tolerance.
Leaf, are you going to be following this story as it evolves? To pick a word from the ether.
I absolutely will be following this story as it evolves, and I think we've seen so many exciting developments in the past, few years that, and we, as we say, we have all the tools to be, or more tools now to be looking at these fragments of bone and stuff. So I think watch this space.
Is there a word for them, by the way, Holden? We've said Homo sapiens. We've said Dennis. So there's these new guys. They're just the bones in China still. Why is that?
Yeah, at the moment they're known as HLD6. I think there would have to be more study done, more confirmation, and if they are, as the Denisovans were, confirmed as a distinct species, then they will be named.
HLD6. We can do better than that. Ideas on a postcard. Okay, Leaf, you're up next after this. Okay, Leaf, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A step forward in how patients with ME are looked after.
Like on my bad days, I can't walk properly. I can just about get out of bed. Some days I can just about lift my arm up.
And do you know when it's coming on?
Well, I can usually tell if I'm like doing schoolwork. I'll look at a page and I'll skim over it, and then my lips will just go dry, and then I know I'm going to be in bed for a good while after that.
ME sufferer Olivia Cole speaking to ITV's Good Morning Britain back in 2015. What's the story this week, Lee?
So doctors and medical students are apparently going to be offered more training as part of a new national strategy that is attempting to improve attitudes to ME and also trust patients with ME more and kind of integrate their personal experience more into the care for people with ME. So the government is also planning on promoting medical research to find treatments for ME, because there's still the treatments are sort of really not very good, and try and involve people with ME in a consultation period that's going to go on for 8 weeks. So it's an attempt to improve the care for people with ME.
And as I said, I mean, that clip is from 2015. It's hard, actually, to find much mainstream media discussion about ME, and so you end up reaching for those sorts of relatively ancient interviews to illustrate your point. So tell us a little bit about it. What is ME?
ME is also known as chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's thought to affect around 240,000 people in England. One of the reasons why we don't hear very much about it is that people with ME tend to drop out of society sometimes. Some of them, cope with it very well, but the symptoms include prolonged fatigue, dizziness, pain, sleep disorders, and sometimes gut issues. And other stuff can come up as well. So if you have it really quite badly, then you might be bedbound, and therefore you're not in the streets with a kind of rash on your face. You'll be too tired sometimes to get out of bed. People who have it really badly have to be tube fed. There was a colleague I used to work with. He had it and had to drop out of work. We still don't know what causes it, but some people get it after they develop glandular fever. Other things also seem to be linked with it, and there is currently no cure. There are just different ways of managing the condition, and some people get better and some people don't.
Do you think, Harriet, the fact that there's no cure is one of the reasons why it's slightly swept under the carpet? Because if you're a medic, you want to focus on the things you can cure. You want to talk about the things where you can be proactive. And this is something where everyone's experience is different and difficult.
Well, to that, I would say nothing has a cure until it has a cure. Do you know what I mean? That nothing had a cure originally. What surprised me about this story was that it's actually the first government strategy aimed at improving things for people with chronic fatigue syndrome, and that there wasn't specific training for doctors about this condition. So even though there's no cure, it does also seem to be the case that there wasn't necessarily the training or understanding necessary to even treat people without curing it. What also surprised me about this story was that they think there are about 2.4 times as many women affected by it as men. So there does seem to be some implication there that it could be connected with biology in a way that we don't yet understand. But before I came on this podcast, I asked a friend of mine who has chronic fatigue syndrome to describe what it feels like. And I think that what she said is worth hearing. She said, imagine if someone is at the foot of your bed waving a check for £1 million and saying, all you have to do is get up and you have it. Get up and take it and you have £1 million. And people who are exhausted would fight the tiredness to get up and take it. People with chronic fatigue syndrome physically can't. You physically cannot do it. It's not a tiredness that anybody without this condition can understand.
And actually, that's kind of the stuff of nightmares, isn't it, Holden? This kind of sense of being locked in from your own body and not being able to properly control and achieve your desires. And yet it doesn't get much attention, even in the pantheon of the kind of things people would talk about being worried about being diagnosed with. It's just slightly invisible.
Yeah, and even worse than that, I think it's often been seen as something that isn't entirely real. It's been for a long time, it was referred to as yuppie flu. It sort of came to prominence in the 80s. It had actually first been identified as a condition back in the 1930s, but it seems that there were significant outbreaks in the US in the early 80s, which is what then led it to more prominence. But yes, it was often seen as something that was slightly self-indulgent, perhaps malingering, because it does lack that a simple, concrete way of diagnosing it, and because the symptoms can come and go and appear on a spectrum as well. So some people have it much worse than others. I think it's been a lasting source of frustration to people with it, that it isn't taken as seriously and doesn't have almost the respect as a condition that it would be if there was a simple test where you can say, yes, this person has it. And that, maybe that is the first step towards a treatment that we are so far lacking.
I mean, maybe Dr. Google has a case to answer as well, Leif, in the sense that, if you've got extreme tiredness or mental fogginess or insomnia or some of these slightly nebulous symptoms, just maybe one of those and occasionally, and you try to self-diagnose, you might think you have ME when maybe a doctor would disagree. It's not that clear cut.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, in generally, the stories that I've heard about ME seem to suggest that when you have ME, like you can't get out of bed, as Harriet's described. There was a very tragic story I read about in the Times from a writer called Sean O'Neill, and his daughter Maeve had ME, and she actually died in her age 27 after the illness became completely debilitating. And he said that, and this is a writer who's written a lot about sort of science and health and stuff. That he found it really hard to accept and understand her illness, and that he wanted her to try exercise programs, which used to be recommended as treatment. And he would wonder what trauma had caused her condition. So he says that he sort of believed the medical orthodoxy, and that strained his relationship with his daughter, who has now died.
So the medical orthodoxy being that it's
you should try doing a bit of exercise. Isn't it all in your head? I mean, some doctors were better on this than others, and it's really tragic to think of a lot of ME sufferers who've been kind of radically misunderstood by people, partly because of the medical establishment, which hasn't been exactly, helpful, and it has also really stigmatized them.
But the isn't it all in your head thing, Harriet, doesn't necessarily have to be stigmatizing, in the sense that, someone who's saying that your mind might be causing a physical reaction isn't dismissing the physical symptoms, are they? They're simply saying, or perhaps they should be simply saying, that our mind and body are so intertwined in complex ways we don't always necessarily understand. They're not saying it's not real, but that it might be a result of mental stress that creates physical symptoms. That might be part of what causes it. That shouldn't, in 2023, be something that's seen to dismiss it.
It's an interesting point. I think that there's two things at play here. One, like Leif was saying, the medical orthodoxy it's clear that there hasn't been enough either investment, research, or even updated guidance. I mean, from this story, we now know that the medical professionals are ignoring guidelines set down in 2021 that really stress the importance of listening to a personal experience. So with that in mind, there is not necessarily a dismissal, but there is an issue in the medical profession here. But on the other side, we've got a cultural issue where society tends to equate productivity with value, and being inactive with being lazy and worthless. And that's a problem. It's the stigmatization. And I think when you have a medical, not disinterest, but perhaps ignorance and lack of training, and then that hits a societal stigma and general perception, that's where you've got this problem.
I think this is still a really contentious area, actually, even amongst researchers and medical professionals. I saw an article in The Guardian last month reporting on research from King's College London, which actually was questioning the basis on which the NHS guidelines, which moved people away from trying to encourage exercise, it was questioning the base on which that had been put into effect, and said actually that some patients do benefit from. There's two therapies used. In fact, one is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is supposed to be about reframing patients' attitudes towards exercise and activity, and one is called graded exercise therapy, which is about gradually stepping up. And now it seems that a lot of patients really didn't benefit from this, and a lot were harmed by it. And so you can understand why that guidance would change. But this research suggested that actually there was a group of people with ME who did benefit from it. And so they say that the sort of blanket switch it will be a step back for some.
And presumably a withdrawal of funding as well. I mean, exercise, theoretically, if you can get out of the house, you can do exercise, but CBT requires a therapist, right?
Yes.
Which is coming at a cost to the NHS.
Yeah, withdrawal of funding and a withdrawal of information about that as an option. Like, it's no longer on the list of proposed treatments that doctors will set out. The reason that a lot of patients group pushed for that change and don't want it to be available even as an option is because of that, as you said, Olly, I think that sort of misguided stigma, the idea that a psychological disorder is somehow less valid than a biomedical disorder. But I think that does stem from the years of it being treated as not a real illness. So I think to some people, that sense that it's something that people can get over through therapy feels like it's a callback to that time when it wasn't being accepted as a condition at all.
And also, I mean, just on the question of money, Leaf, I mean, this consultation that the government is doing obviously comes at some cost, but it's implementing things that cost things, isn't it? And is there any indication that, you know, with the learnings from this consultation, we'll see a dramatic reinvestment into ME?
I think dramatic is an optimistic way of putting it. I mean, I choose to be optimistic because I think that ME patients have been, failed really badly. But there has been, I think, a kind of an increased tendency to listen to them in the past few years. So I'm optimistic. But equally, as we know, the NHS is really under strain at the moment. It just seems to be trying to deal with sort of massively urgent issues, A&E and things, beds. So I can't imagine that we're going to become the sort of ME superpower and revolutionise care and sort of set the example around the world, unfortunately.
But I suppose, as you were saying, Harriet, just even a simple retraining, even a day's training of doctors and nurses in this is how you talk to someone with ME sounds like might be beneficial at this point.
Yeah, and if we want to talk about cost, if we just look at the cost, just economically, just hard money, the number of people that are incapacitated by this condition, and I mean, the Times cited a figure to say 1 in 4 sufferers cannot leave the house. That is a huge cost to the country in every possible way, both to the workforce, to the economy, to potential productivity and spending and contribution. And I also think that what's making this more important than ever is the connection to be drawn with long COVID. So the chief executive of the charity, the ME charity, has said that about 50% of people with long COVID have symptoms that directly mirror those with ME. We are really seeing an extraordinary amount of people suffering with long COVID in the country, and it's possible that that number could keep growing, possibly exponentially. We don't know where this is going. So in that sense, this consultation is not going to be particularly expensive. Any rejigging of the priorities, which put an emphasis on listening to patient experience, which anyone with a chronic condition can tell you, they are the expert in their condition, that can only be of net benefit.
Yeah, the parallel with long COVID, I think, is a really telling one. And there's both a negative and a positive to that. The negative being that a lot more people have been exposed to COVID over the past 3 years and look set to continue. So the number of people who run the risk of having this sort of post-viral fatigue is going to increase. But that has brought much more interest and funding and resources to bear on the problem. And in the US, Joe Biden has announced research plans aimed at tackling both long COVID and ME in the past week. And there are other treatments in preliminary stages of research in the US. So I think there is at least some hope that we may start to see development on the treatment and not just the understanding of the condition.
Good. Okay. Harriet, you're up next after this. Okay, Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
When it comes to modern dating, are the odds stacked against us?
So I just saw that and thought, why not? Let's see how it goes putting 3 in one day. One in the morning, a gym class and a coffee, followed by a coffee and a walk, and then for a drink. The problem is, if one person wants to push you back by half an hour or so, it ruins your whole schedule for the day.
Journalist Roisin Kelly talking to Woman's Hour on BBC Radio 4 last month. Harriet, what was she talking about?
She's talking about date stacking, which is a new viral term for something that's probably as old as dating itself, and that is scheduling multiple dates in one day, sometimes even back to back. And she's also, what's happened in the last week is that she's written a piece about the backlash that she has experienced about writing and trying out this dating trend. So it's clearly touched a nerve here, because she wrote in the Sunday Times that the vile misogynistic and incredibly high levels of trolling that she received in response to her writing about this dating trend went far beyond what she normally receives for writing about dating.
Right, yeah. So you've got to bake in that if you write about dating and you're a young woman writing about dating, then a load of middle-aged men are going to write unflattering things to you. But even despite that, people were calling her names because she was essentially going on more than one date a day.
Exactly. And that's where I thought that this was really interesting, because as she points out in her radio interview, scheduling 3 dates in one day once a week is no different to going on 3 dates in a week, really. But it seems to have really touched a nerve with people. I mean, lots and lots and lots of women rallied in her defense and said things like they found dating stacking absolutely necessary. They're really busy. Maybe they get one night off where they've got work events, family commitments, friends, hobbies, real busy, fulfilling lives. Perhaps if you had one night in the evening, in the week, that you might go on a couple of dates, what's the harm? But she found that a lot of male writers found it to be a kind of implication of promiscuity, as if the implication would be that she would sleep with every single one of them on the same night, which obviously is not at all true. But she said what's interesting is that some of the men that got in touch with her said that they did this too, but they received praise and adulation for it from their friends, and not the horrible trolling that she did.
Okay. I mean, just leaving the gender out of it for a second, Leaf, just in terms of the principle, date stacking, it's ruthlessly efficient. It's just whether that is admirable or off-putting, I suppose, isn't it, as to how you approach this? I mean, is it a good thing to try and find the man of your dreams quickly, or is it actually just a little bit utilitarian and depressing?
I think it's pragmatic. I think particularly if you live in a city and you have a busy life, and you don't have many nights off to go and find the love of your life, then it makes sense. I kind of have sympathy with the idea that it's not that it is a bit depressing, because it is a kind of a bit like just lining people up and not maybe, and it does have a sort of commodity feel to it. But at the same time, I've been so frustrated by the abuse this woman has got, because a lot of the comments are from also older women who are saying, "Oh dear, what you've got to do, love, is meet your man in Sainsbury's and fall in love slowly, and unfortunately, or in a bar. Unfortunately, the dating landscape has changed immeasurably over the past few years. I mean, you don't get chatted up in bars as much as used to happen. So women are responding to the market. The market is telling them, unfortunately, you kind of have to go on apps these days. I mean, if you're lucky enough, you'll meet someone at a party or something. But I think that Roisin Kelly is kind of responding to the kind of the landscape around her. And while, it's depressing and it might maybe lead to dating fatigue, it does make sense to me.
There's also, I suppose, this sort of strange distance between what people do online and then what people are expected to do in real life, Holden. I mean, people are now accustomed to the idea that on Tinder, for example, I mean, they're the kind of market leader, aren't they? People swipe around and will possibly be flirting and chatting, virtual dating with 10 people at once. And that's fine because that's how you use the app. All this is a real life version of that, where you then see them but quickly move on to someone else.
Yeah, I think it probably does set the expectation, as you're saying, but also sort of creates the necessity for more dates, because I think, if you were meeting somebody in Sainsbury's or a bar or at a party, by the time you get to an official date, you've kind of done a lot of the filtering. You're interested in that person, and there's at least the sort of basis for a conversation at the very least. Whereas if you have just been chatting in text online and you've only seen a few photos, then by the time you meet somebody for the first time, you could very quickly realize you've made a mistake. And so you need to do sort of more of that, more of what would previously have been an initial kind of, gut reaction is going to happen on the date rather than before it. So yeah, you're probably going to need to meet more people. And so that creates the need for this sort of efficient approach to dispatching those who you turns out you don't have as much of an interest as you thought you might.
It occurs to me as well, Harriet, that there might be some compassion, surprisingly, in this vitriolic blowback that this journalist has received, in the sense that maybe some of these people, this might not be true, but some of these people who have responded through trolling are thinking that the men on the other end didn't know they were part of a speed dating scenario, that they were being stacked. And therefore it's just unfair. She's using them. They've turned up in honesty for a date that might end up, going on for hours, might end up back at her place. And, they didn't realize it was going to be 1 hour and she's on to the next one.
That's it. I think that's the absolute crux of this, is the honesty question. And in prepping this story, I found that I was a massive hypocrite, as it turns out, because I have been on the receiving end of a date stacking situation. I've been a stackee, and I was offered the middle slot. I was offered the slot that was neither right after work with drinks and food, and not at the end of the night. So I was effectively offered a slot where I was neither going to be getting fed nor getting anything else. So I was absolutely outraged. I mean, I was absolutely incandescent at the audacity. I don't know who he thought he was, but having reflected on that, I thought, it was incredibly honest. And I do think that honesty is really important here. I think when you go into a date situation, it's important to say, we can only go to this thing because I've got to go to a work event afterwards, or I've got to go to a dinner. Or setting expectations and being honest is incredibly important. But also, it's no different really than anything I've done, which might be scheduling a date with someone, ending up at a party somewhere else, and then being on a date with someone else. It's not a nice.
No, but that's serendipity. That's different.
It is different.
And you feel a bit bad about it, right? You went to the party with someone else, and then you flirted with someone else.
No. I haven't chucked someone at a party. No, that's not that. Just to be clear. But I think that what's really important here to know is that there is an element that we haven't discussed about the honesty, which is the honesty of how people represent themselves on dating apps. So there's been a lot of people who've said, I've spoken to this person on a dating app. We've chatted. We seem to have got on well. We've exchanged information. We've arranged to meet, only for me then to find that their photo was a photo of someone else, or they're a completely different age, or they're a completely different person. And that is the danger of using dating apps. And I do think that that's a really important thing to consider. Why would I want to spend my evening with someone who it becomes immediately obvious to me that I don't want to ever see again?
One thing that we haven't mentioned here is that dating is extremely expensive. And so I would rather be saddled for just an hour with someone that I don't fancy and don't want to see again than 2 or 3 hours.
Well, our recording normally takes 50 minutes.
Then 2 or 3 hours where I've spent, 80 quid on drinks and dinner. So I think that it's also it could be a response to the cost of living crisis where, people are having to make savings where they can.
Holden, you've been in a long-term relationship.
Since a time before apps existed.
As have I. And I don't know if you agree with me where I'm in two minds about what would happen if I found myself newly single. There's the sort of the excitement of trying these apps. When I was dating, I was never in a world where this was possible. It does feel like the world's your oyster. But then on the other hand, it just sounds enormously stressful and something I can't relate to.
Yeah, I have similarly mixed feelings. And being gay, I think it would have been a huge advantage to have apps at the time when I was single and when I didn't have many gay friends, and it was just quite hard to find people. And
you really need to know which branch of Sainsbury's you're in.
Exactly. And I'm sure now, as part of Pride Month, they probably do host gay shopping evenings, and maybe that is a way. But although on the other hand, gay bars have been really negatively affected by the rise of apps. And, that was once the place that people went to meet. And now a lot of that does happen online. And so, that real world space is gone. But I think as well, that sense of there being both an unlimited supply of people out there and also it being hard to make a meaningful connection with anyone probably does make it more difficult in the app world to find a connection that matters. And I used online dating sites, and I had some good dates and some bad dates, but in the end it was actually through friends that I met my partner. And at that point it was almost the tipping point when meeting people through friends and through work were the prime ways that people did find a long-term partner. And if you look at the statistics now, work has dropped like a stone. Like very few people now meet through work, which I think has a lot to do with sort of societal discomfort about workplace relationships. And even meeting at a bar or other kind of entertainment place has dropped too. And I think it was Leif who was saying that it's much more rare to be hit on by a man. And I think that probably is actually a kind of sensitivity about straight men not wanting to feel like they are making women uncomfortable has probably led to a bit more of a kind of distancing there.
I mean, so if we're broadly in favour of date stacking with some reservations, I'm just curious, what slot would you want? Harriet, morning, afternoon or evening?
I'm not cute in the morning. I'm not getting a second date. If someone sees me in the morning, that's not going anywhere.
Leif, morning, afternoon or evening?
I'd say probably morning, in the hope that it would be so good that they'd blast through their second and third dates. Not to be arrogant,
yes.
But that's the dream, isn't it?
Hog them for the day. Holden, you're left with the afternoon. Are you okay with that?
Well, we did meet first over lunch, so I...
We did. Arian was there too. It strikes me as a different app.
It's a very modern kind of relationship.
Well, I'm off to Sainsbury's. My thanks to Holden, Leif and Harriet. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released, morning, afternoon or evening. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producers, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we swipe right to unwrap next week, bye-bye.